everyone. I welcome you to CEC lecture series. I am Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. Today's lecture is part of the new series that we have started, which is on English poetry. So in today's lecture, we are going to discuss and share a few introductory thoughts about this form of writing. And in this lecture series, we are particularly going to discuss the 20th century English poems. So, with that in mind, today's lecture is titled English Poetry, an Introduction and the 20th Century. So, as I just now said that we are going to talk a bit about the form of poetry writing. The first thing that we ask is, what is a poem and poetry? Of course, these are two words, right? Two different words. Are they interchangeable? Can we use them interchangeably? Let's look at that. First thing that we say is that poem and poetry are the two terms that commonly define a form of expression in literature, right? So, I would say that while poem is more specifically the form, but poetry is a slightly, I would say, it is more idea centered, while poem is a form. We are going to make it clear in just a bit, but let us first understand poem. What exactly is it, right? The first thing that we say is that poem is markedly different from prose. Yes, so in English literature, we understand that there are different forms of expression. For example, there's poetry, there's drama, there's fiction, there's narrative, there's also the form of the essay, right? So these are different forms of expression, or one can say, the different, styles adopted by the writer in order to share thoughts. So, the foremost thing then about poetry is that it is, of course, different from prose. That's what we said. Now, when we say that it is different from prose, we need to understand also that what exactly is prose, because you see, whenever you talk in literature, these two terms you always come across. So, when you are dealing with a poem, you know that the aesthetics, the stylization is very different from how it would be in a prose. Yes, so usually what they say is that a poem is also, or for that matter even prose, is defined in terms of the negative of its opposite, right? So the opposite of poem would then be prose. So let's understand what is prose, so that in comparison then we are able to get a better understanding of what poem actually is. So prose is a form of written language that follows the natural flow of speech, a language's grammatical structures. That's the first thing that we say, right? That it is a form of written language. So prose is written, right? That follows a natural flow of speech. What do we mean by natural flow of speech? It means that the way we talk in our day-to-day life, there is a flow to the way we talk, right? So that is the natural flow of speech, the way people interact, the way people express their ideas in general. Now again, that is not to say that the language is always as simple or as informal as it is in day-to-day life. So please note that there is a difference. We are talking about the flow of speech and not the language use, right? So in prose, it is of course a form of written language that follows the natural flow of speech, and it also follows a language's grammatical structures, right? That's the second thing that we had said, that it also follows the grammatical structures of a language. For example, the way a sentence is constructed, the use of the articles, the use of other parts of speech, all of these are kind of then followed. All these rules are followed when when an author is writing a prose. The third thing that we say is that it does not have a metrical structure or a rhyme scheme. So a prose will never rhyme. It is not rhythmic. it doesn't have that musicality to it. So that's why we say that it does not have a metrical structure or a rhyme scheme. And the last thing that we say is that a prose is primarily divided into fiction and non-fiction, right? So these four things, mark what a prose is. First, it's a written language that follows the natural flow of speech. Second, it also follows the language's, grammatical structures. Third, it does not have a metrical or a rhyme scheme. And fourth, it is primarily divided into fiction and non-fiction. So that, broadly speaking, is prose. Now we come to what is a poem, right, which is just the opposite of prose. And we say a poem is a form of literary expression that uses rhythmic and figurative language to convey a vast meaning and emotion. Now you see, there are some very crucial words over here. Of course, just like prose, even poem is a form of literary expression. But how does it differ? The first thing is that it uses a rhythmic language, means that there is some kind of a musicality to it. But again, you might ask this question, that does all poetry rhyme? No. The answer is no. Not all poems have a rhyme, but definitely there is a meter, which means that there is a certain method, a certain way in which the words are kind of arranged in a given sentence. So you will not have full grammatical sentences as we were talking about in the case of prose, but in a poem the poet takes liberty with language, right? And of course, in a lot of occasions there is rhythm, there is music, there is rhyme. Yes, so that is one of the things which distinguishes poem. And the other thing that we have said is that there is also figurative language. Now, what do we mean by figurative language? Language which is used to, one can say which has two meanings at the same point. A, there is a surface meaning, and then there is a meaning which is suggested, right? And you might ask that how do we identify that the language is figurative? If you remember, at some point you would have learned about the figures of speech, right? One is of course parts of speech in English, which is noun, pronoun, etc. Then on the other hand, we have figures of speech. Figures of speech are simile, metaphor, anaphora, alliteration, etc. What are these? These are different, I would say, ways of using language whereby a word tends to convey a meaning much more than its surface meaning, right? So, to put it very simply, that's what we mean by that the language is figurative. And hence, because it is of course rhythmic and it's figurative, therefore in poetry, language conveys, as we just now said, a vast meaning and emotion. So that is something which is the defining feature, that in fewer words, in shorter sentences, a deeper meaning is conveyed, and of course there is an associated emotion as well, right? So that is one of the quintessential features of a poem, and we now, I'm sure, understand how does it differ from a prose. Yes, so having seen this idea, we come to the third point which I had introduced in the beginning, that is poetry. Yes, we said that one word is poem and the other is poetry. So now, having discussed what a poem is, that it's a particular form of expression in literature which has these features which we just now discussed, but then what is poetry, right? Poetry is definitely a bit different from what we say as what a poem is. Yes, in day-to-day use, sometimes they are used interchangeably, but if you go into the details, there's something extra which is conveyed by the word poetry. Now, there's a thinker, John Stuart Mill, who was there in 19th century. He wrote an essay called Thoughts on Poetry and Its Variety. Now, in this essay, he makes some very important points about what is poetry, how does it differ from other forms of expression, etc. Right? So, let us look at some of the points that John Stuart Mill makes in this essay. The first thing that he says is poetry is something that may exist in prose or verse, something that does not require even the instrument of words, unquote. Let's read this again because it is saying a bit more than what we might immediately gather. So he says poetry is something that may exist in prose or verse, something that does not require even the instrument of words. What is the first thing that Mill is doing? He is establishing the fact that poetry can be seen in prose as well as verse. Verse meaning a poem, right? So poetry can be a part of prose or fiction or non-fiction, and it can also be a part of verse, right? So automatically, which means what? That it is transcending the difference of, it is going beyond just the, difference of structure. And so if it exists or if it may exist in both prose and verse, then what is it? He says that it is something that does not require even the instrument of words, right? So one can say perhaps that poetry is kind of a essence. While a poem is made up of words, poetry is more than just what we see formed in a given structure through words, right? So the first thing is, the first point that we make, don't worry, we're going to get to make more sense of it, because this is a very subtle point that Mill makes, and it's important for us to understand this. So the first thing that we say is that poetry is that which exists in both prose as well as verse, and it is that which does not require even the instrument of words. So that's why, you must have heard, they say that this art is very poetic, right? Or they say that, sometimes they say that even the walk is very poetic. And sometimes they also say, there's a word called, there's a phrase where they say the poetry of life. So what do we mean by, when we say poetry of life, it does not mean that a poem written on life, but it means an essential feature of life. Now, what is this essential feature which is indicated by the word poetry is something that we will see further ahead. So the second point that Mill makes in the essay is that, and I quote, he says, the object of poetry is to act upon emotion, and therein it is distinguished from its logical opposite, that is not prose but matter of fact or science, unquote. Now here, Mill is making a point. While on the one hand we say poem is the opposite of prose, but he says the opposite of poetry is not prose, but it is a matter of fact or science. Why does he say that? Let's see. He says that because the object of poetry is to act upon emotion. Wherever there is an element of emotion involved, so there can be an emotion in art, there can be an emotion in a film, there can be an emotion, as they say, even life. That's why we say the poetry of life. So when we use the phrase poetry of life, what would it mean? It would mean different emotions, the ups and downs of emotions, the intense emotions, the differences of emotions that we experience through life. All of that together is what we call as the poetry, as its poetry, because it's never the same, right? We experience life differently, just the way we experience emotions differently at different point of time. So that's why John Stuart Mill establishes that poetry is to act upon the emotion, and where the logical opposite is fact or science, right? That's the second point that he makes about poetry. Third, Now he gives us, one can say, a kind of a list of features which makes it still more clear what we mean by poetry. Okay, the first thing he says, poetry addresses itself to feelings and science addresses itself to belief. Again, two opposite things, right? So whenever we talk about poetry, we talk about emotion, we talk about feelings. And when we talk about science or fact, we're talking about belief, right? That you are made to believe in the existence of something. That's science, right? When you're made to feel about something, that's poetry. Next, he also says that poetry works by moving and science works by persuading. And these are two very important words, moving and persuading. Moving means that there is an appeal made to your emotion, there is an appeal made to your sensibility, you are made to feel a certain way, you're made to think a certain way, and that evokes a certain mood, a certain atmosphere, and the resultant emotions or the resultant thoughts and the resultant, I would say, state is created in an individual. So that's why I say that poetry works by moving, right? That's the part that it appeals to in you. While on the other hand, science works by persuading. What do we mean by persuading? Making you believe something, making you believe in something. That, okay, this is true and this is not true. Or this is the real side of things, or this is the constructed side of things. All of that is the domain of science. But the domain of feeling, thought, state, mood is all connected to poetry, right? A third thing that he says is poetry offers interesting objects of contemplation to the sensibilities, while science acts by presenting a proposition to understanding. Now you see, you must be noting here that there are these certain words which are put in a different color, because these words are important for us to really differentiate what poetry and science is. So poetry, he says, offers interesting objects of contemplation to the sensibilities. What do we mean by that? Objects of contemplation. Contemplation meaning when you sit and think, you mull over something, you give something a thought, you contemplate, right? So that's what poetry makes you do. You see, you must have experienced it. Whenever you read a poem, a lot of times, if a poem is very hard hitting, you at times just stop, right? You stop, you don't read further, but you just allow certain emotions to settle, right? Because you have been hit hard, you have been moved by the words. Sometimes it also makes you think. That's what it says. Poetry offers interesting objects of contemplation to the sensibilities. You see, contemplation of course involves thought, but contemplation not intellectually alone, but objects of contemplation to the sensibilities. Sensibilities meaning your ability to respond emotionally, intuitively to an experience which is put in front of you. So poetry then makes you think, makes you contemplate, makes you feel, makes you imagine, makes you engage with the object, not intellectually, but at the level of sensibilities. While on the other hand, science acts by presenting a proposition to understanding. It's not to say that poetry is not to be understood. Definitely poetry is also meant to be understood. But there is a greater element of emotion, sensibility, contemplation in this form of expression as compared to science, which is given to understanding, right? So Science then acts by presenting a proposition to understanding. So there's a proposition in front of you and you understand it. That's what is science. So these are some of the important, I would say, distinctions that he makes, that John Stuart Mill makes between poetry and science. The next important point that we say is that there are many great poems, right? We now come back to the form. What we have seen so far is what is a poem, how is it different from prose, what is a prose, and then the third thing that we have discussed is what is poetry and how is poetry different from a poem. Okay. Once again, to reiterate, at times poetry and poem are used interchangeably, but of course there is an extra meaning which is conveyed through poetry that we just now discussed. From there we move to the fourth point, where we talk about form a bit more, and we say that many great poems are in the form of a narrative, and there is poetry in all good fiction as well. Now, what does this tell us? That these two forms of expression, they are not set in stone, or they are not, they do not exist in watertight compartments, right? We don't say, so what John Stuart Mill is also making us realize is that how there are poems which are written in the form of a narrative. You would have heard of the word ballad. In a ballad, it's a form of a poem, but it reads like a story, right? So that's why we say that there are poems which are written in the form of a narrative, and likewise, there is poetry in all good fiction. Now, when we say that there is poetry in all good fiction, doesn't mean that there is a poem in the middle of a narrative, right? Again, go back to what we just now discussed, that poetry is an appeal to your sensibility. It is an object of contemplation given to sensibility. It moves you, it involves emotion, etc. So, with that definition, we say that there is poetry also in fiction. Because when you read a story, a novel, even then you are moved to emotion. Even then there is an intuitive side of you which is, one can say, activated. You do feel, you do sometimes stop to think before you go on and read further. So that's what Mill is saying, that there is some poems are in the form of a narrative, and some narratives have poetry. Okay, so that's the fourth point that we make. All right. Next, what he says is that he makes us understand the difference. Then, if on the one hand we say that poems can be written in a narrative form, you might ask, what is the difference between the two then, right? Is it that the boundaries are too fluid? No. Yes, there are points of commonalities, but essentially poem and a story, they are different. Now, how are they different? Mill is going to talk about that next. He says, interest felt in a story is derived from incident, and in poetry, it is derived from the representation of feelings. Which means what? That in a story, what makes you interested in a story, or what makes you like a story? An incident, event, because a story is nothing but a collection of different events, different actions which you see happening in a given context, in a given situation, where there are characters, there are representation of the surroundings, etc. So what makes a story interesting is the incident. And on the contrary, in a poetry, interest is derived from the representation of feelings, right? Feelings, once again, an important part of poetry, right? Next, he says, the truth of poetry is to paint the human soul truly, and the truth of fiction is to give a true picture of life, unquote. Now, once again, another point of distinction. The truth of poetry. What do we mean by truth of poetry? It means the true purpose, right? The essence of what poetry does. What is the essence? To paint the human soul truly. Human soul as in uh, our, our capability to feel, our capability to mull over things, our capability to contemplate, to go inside, to think, to feel, and thereby understand. So that's what he says, that the truth of poetry is to paint the human soul truly, that the entire universe of human emotions is brought out. And the truth of fiction is to give a picture, a true picture of life. A true picture of life meaning that there are instances, there are circumstances from life, different ideas connected to them, they are brought out in fiction. So that's the other thing, which is the difference between poetry and fiction. And the last thing that he says is, poetry is impassioned truth or thoughts colored by feelings, unquote. Again, which means what? Poetry is an impassioned truth. Impassioned means which has an element of passion associated with it. What is truth? Truth means an aspect of life, something or an understanding of life, right? It's not in the sense of true or false, but truth over here means, a dimension of life, an aspect of life, right? When that is presented in an impassioned manner, so it is an impassioned truth, a truth which has associated with it emotions. So that is poetry. He says, or we can also say that poetry is thoughts colored by feelings. Now, this is a befitting line to conclude the discussion of poetry. Why? Because it says that while yes, in poetry there is a emphasis on sensibility, emotion, etc., but that does not mean that there is no thought in poetry, right? So there is thought, there are ideas. That's why, towards the end, John Stuart Mill says that poetry is thoughts colored by feelings. So both of them brought together, right? So in this lecture, I really hope that now you have a sense of what a poem is. So that's what we discussed. First, we discussed what is a poem and how is it different from a prose. We understood what is a prose. Third, we came to the word poetry. We looked at what exactly is the meaning of poetry, how, yes, at times it is used interchangeably with the word poem, but it does have or it does convey an extra meaning. And what is that extra meaning? And it's an appeal to sensibility, appeal to emotions, appeal to which makes you contemplate. So therefore, we say that poetry is not found only in poems, but it can also be found in various other forms of expression and in life as well. And thereafter, John Stuart Mill, by means of contrast from science and other disciplines, he makes further clear what is the essence of poetry, right? So I hope that now you're clear about what this form of expression entails, how is it different from the other ways of expressing. And in the next part of the lecture, we are going to talk about the 20th century poetry. Thank you.